Thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you, David, for the introduction. Note it's not radiobiology. I'm a radiation epidemiologist, not a radiobiologist. It's an honor to be in this panel today. In terms of the first question, which is the current ICNIRP risk assessment sufficiently robust and reliable for protective policy making? I'd like to remind you that the current ICNIRP risk assessment is entirely based on observation of effects of RF that have been clearly demonstrated, as we've heard from Professor Croft, and that is nerve stimulation, changes to permeability of cell membranes, and temperature rise. Now, as you've heard, there have been experimental and epidemiological studies that do suggest possible associations between lower levels of radio frequency electromagnetic fields, such as those that we receive from communicating devices and technologies all around us, and health. Now, the ICNIRP risk assessment does briefly review some of these reported associations. I think one might argue with the interpretation of some of the findings by ICNIRP, which dismisses the reported findings for any endpoint. As you've heard, for cancer, for example, it dismisses the recent large-scale animal studies because, of course, there are multiple tests, but at the same time, findings focus on specific types of tumors, which have been the topic of interest for a long time. And ICNIRP also dismisses the epidemiological studies on cancer, paying more attention to ecological studies of time trends and to cohort studies that have limited power to identify small risks and inadequate exposure assessments, and basically dismissing more the case control studies. Now, the associations I mentioned have not been clearly demonstrated, but the observations raise the possibility that the 2020 guidelines might not be sufficiently robust and reliable for protection of the public and workers. In terms of the second question, which is, are the ICNIRP recommended exposure limits for EMF RF sufficiently protective to avoid harm from lower level, longer term exposures that are below the ICNIRP limits? Well, the limits were based on confirmed adverse health effects, as Professor Croft just mentioned. And though the limits are meant to apply to all possible effects, they're actually based on higher levels of RF, which do cause short-term tissue heating. So as I mentioned for question one, we do have evidence from recent studies in experimental animals, as well as from epidemiological studies, that lower athermal levels of RF might increase the risk of cancer and of other health outcomes, including possible cognitive and behavioral effects in young people, sleep, nonverbal intelligence, and so on. Well, the evidence to date is not conclusive. And if these findings are confirmed, then obviously exposure limits based on short-term tissue heating effects would not be sufficiently protective. Clearly, without conclusive evidence, and given the great uncertainty in exposure levels, it's obviously very difficult to set basic restriction levels. But I think that the widespread use of RF emitting communicating devices and technologies does warrant some caution. And I think that in the absence of stronger evidence, I would think of the policy of ALARA as used in ionizing radiation, that means as low as reasonably achievable, should definitely be considered. Finally, the third question is about whether there's enough independent research into the health and environmental effects of 5G. Now, personally, I don't think that there is enough research, independent or not, into the health effects of 5G, as 5G is still really in its infancy. Though mobile phone operators in Europe offer 5G contracts, the technology is far from being fully operational, and the offers to date are restricted to what's called 5G non-standalone in frequency bands close to those already in use for mobile telephony and for Wi-Fi. The use of much higher frequencies, so-called the millimeter waves, is foreseen for the future. And though we know some of the mechanisms by which radiofrequency EMF interact with tissue, we know little about possible effects of these high frequencies. Currently, population exposure to 5G is still very limited. So therefore, it's not possible to evaluate using epidemiological methods the impact 5G might have on population exposures and on health. Should say that exposure measurement is also very difficult because the technological advances such as the massive MIMO and the beamforming dramatically affect the spatial and the temporal distribution of exposure, and standard measurement protocols cannot currently take this into account. So because of this, I think that research is needed on measurement protocols, on exposure assessment, and in epidemiology, once 5G is actually really implemented, as well as mechanistic research for the in vitro and in vivo experimental studies, especially in the higher frequencies, to evaluate the impact on health of new exposure characteristics, including frequency band, linked with the deployment of 5G. Thank you.